was racing well. Wow. But not for long. 3095 horsepower tested at home. Let's see what we can do with it next. Up here we have a 400 horsepower drum today, which in the previous video raced against an M car and something went wrong. I bet you're all very curious about what actually happened to the engine. And we will show and tell you everything in this series. So get your popcorn ready and let's go. After the fight at Borispolskaya, it was clear that something was wrong with the engine, judging by its behavior. Anyway, I decided to drive to our third service station on Petrovka. We're shooting here right now, by the way.
I mean, you just held onto the money and drove with an engine that's built for the front.
Well, where's that chateau? Well, actually, the way I figure it, if something happened to the piston, or it broke, cracked a baffle or something, there's probably already scoring on the cylinders, and there's no way to save the engine. And no matter how much I drive it, there's nothing I can do and I've got to replace it. But if it's something like an injector, spark plug, or coil, that's relatively minor, and the engine should be fine, even if I drive, let's say, on 3.5 cylinders. Because saying it was misfiring, that's not exactly the case. It was more like it was running on 3.5 cylinders, roughly speaking. And imagine this, I'm driving to our third service station at Petrovka, calmly, not pushing it, carefully, and I'm thinking, we did an experiment like this, throwing money in there purely for tuning, and there was a chance of something happening to the engine, but we hoped it wouldn't. And imagine the motor, which costs around $3,500 in Kiev, and you still need to replace it. So it could be a total loss out of nowhere. If something happened to the piston, like scratches or wear, then roughly speaking, the block is a write-off, and there's not much you can do. And you'll just have to replace the engine. So there are tests, experiments, but on top of the money already spent, you'll have to add another $500. So in total, $3,500 plus $500. And that is...
By the way, today I need to calculate how much money went into the car for the first, second, and third stages of the hybrid turbo.
Well, from stage 2 to stage 3, we'll do the math. Exactly, I've already calculated my expenses. But imagine, where do you think you'd spend $4,000? Sergei Baikov, where would you spend it? That's what. But where to spend it, I passed. By the way, post in the comments where you would spend if you knew you were about to pass.
Well, where would you throw them in right now? You know, go and live in Thailand for 6 months somewhere or invest in a new motor. Anyway, we're not talking about that.
We're doing experiments for you, for us. Anyway, let's move on. What's making you sad? What if it's just the injector, coil, or spark plug, or maybe the PCV valve? I mean, maybe it'll turn out to be something simpler, or it could be the piston. Yes. Nothing funny, of course. By the way, we are at the same service station on Petrovka. And here the mechanics slowly began to diagnose our drum. Here, in fact, the project began. There was the first, second stage, and here it ended. Yeah, right. We started by doing an endoscope check. First, we unscrewed the spark plug, and there was something like coolant or something wet. So we thought maybe the gasket got damaged or something got clogged. Then I thought, let's try something more specific. We needed clear information, a precise diagnosis, or at least something close to it, to know if there was any point in, for example, hiding the engine and so on. We checked the coils, injectors, and spark plugs. Everything seemed fine there. Unfortunately, yes. Well, there was also the PCV valve option. We checked it, and the membrane was intact. Everything was fine. So the crankcase gases were causing some concern. They don't just appear out of nowhere. We ran a leak test in each of the cylinders. Exactly. With that, you can check if the gasket is blown. Or if there's a crack in the cylinder head. So we apply pressure and check if the coolant system pressure rises, whether bubbles are forming in the reservoir or not. This time, everything was clear, and there were no signs like that. So it didn't really look like a blown gasket, but the leak test showed different leak percentages in each cylinder. The highest, if I'm not mistaken, was in the second and third cylinders. In the second cylinder, there was something like 70–80% leakage, and in the third, it was around 50%. The point was that in several cylinders, The leakage percentages were different. You might ask, why didn't I check the compression? Well, from experience, I know that compression tests reveal big holes. If there are large gaps or holes, the compression will show a difference. But if you have small cracks, like a coolant leak or something similar, the compression test won't really show much. The compression will be even across the cylinders. A leak tester, on the other hand, is much more sensitive to various leaks. Exactly, that's why we started with the leak test. The compression also turned out to be slightly lower in the second and third cylinders. So basically, there were almost 99% suspicions that we'd have to dive into the engine and remove the cylinder head. And here, there's still a bit of intrigue for both us and you. If we do open up the engine, what do we see? Pause and write a comment, please.
Well, I mean, either way, we're gonna see something that's $2,000 the fuck out of it. I mean, what's 2, maybe 4?
Dear customer, your cylinder. No pistons were found in your cylinder. There are no scratches in the second cylinder where the biggest leak is, the one around 80%. The pistons are also intact. It's possible that the partition walls broke. Between the piston rings, the disassembly will reveal what happened. We'll also have to check the valves on top.
We also did an endoscopy of all the cylinders. Nothing bad was found there. The cylinder walls are just as intact and smooth as they were on stock during stage 2 and before stage 3. So the 400 horsepower didn't affect the walls at all. That was a pretty good piece of news, meaning the block will likely be fine, and we won't need to replace it. We also checked the oil filter, as usual. He, by the way, was recently changed before the third stage. I think they're 1,000 kilometers, probably not even past. Checked it out. Everything's fine there, no metal shavings. The 400 horsepower is not a problem with this motor so far.
This is considering the car has 200,000 kilometers on the odometer. And it's been running on stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 tunes, and it doesn't seem to care at all.
As sad as it is, we've started taking the engine apart. To do this, we separated the body from the subframe. We lifted the car up on the lift, and the subframe with the engine is now on the table below. It was easier to disassemble and remove it, so we placed it on an engine stand. The first surprise we got during disassembly, after removing the cylinder head, was when we looked at the condition of the combustion chambers. And we found cracks in some of the cylinders between the plug and the valve seat. This kind of thing happened with M50 engines that were turbocharged, like the one I had on my E46, the M50 B27 Turbo, a custom build. In those engines, cracks like that would occur. Usually people tried to replace the cylinder head. Welding it was a real hassle. I asked the mechanics about their experience and what they had seen with clients' engines, and the information I got was that engines with such cracks can still run fine. So even without a chip, just disassembling it for one issue, they found cracks, didn't replace the head, put it back, and it kept running fine as usual. But of course, we would recommend replacing the cylinder head to clients with such issues. Then we checked the pistons. At first glance, you couldn't tell that anything had happened because nothing was visible on the endoscope. But then we started removing parts and noticed that the rings on the cylinders with bad compression, just a couple of them, were slightly bent, not sitting perfectly. So the compression was leaking due to the rings. And the cherry on top? As many of you probably guessed, it turned out to be the second piston. And here it is, the second piston, the culprit of all this trouble. We took it out, we looked at it, and there's a baffle in it. What we thought was the baffle between the first and second ring. It had burst and, roughly speaking, it was hanging out like that. And because of it, the compression was lost. There was wear, so the engine wasn't running properly. The good news is that the cylinder has a cast iron sleeve. It turned out to be intact. It wasn't damaged by that loose piece. You understand? It could have been much worse. That piece could have been bouncing around and caused scratches in the cylinder. So, in fact, we ended up with 2 bad pieces of news. We have a piston that needs to be replaced. And there's the cylinder head with cracks. But there was some very good news that the block doesn't have to be replaced. The engine doesn't have to be replaced. I mean, we're definitely not looking at $3,500 right now.
But this kid ain't going back to his own.
Yeah, but this little guy won't be able to compete in the team of 4 N20 pistons, boosted to the limit against the M3. And he won't be able to fight anywhere else. That's it. He's retired. Yeah, we'll just put him in the Garage Racer Museum to show clients. But if anyone's truly passionate about the project, subscribe to Instagram. Everyone who's been following for a while already knows that the drum is intact and has been running for quite some time now. It's already been upgraded, with a bunch of cool upgrades for our new project going from rags to riches. And you can check it out, how he's doing. Wow. Air working, and it's running smoothly. We quickly grabbed a used piston from an N20. By the way, our mechanic who was disassembling the engine had an N20 on hand. As for the cylinder head, the mechanic and the manager suggested I find a used, intact one. But I didn't want to deal with that at the time. And well, we love experiments. I decided to take it on myself, at my own risk. I decided to put the same cylinder head back on and see how it would perform, how long it would last on stage 2, stage 3, and so on. As for the rings, bearings, chains, and various consumables, we all agreed to replace them. By the way, you asked us about the chain. We checked it, and it was fine before all these experiments. So we decided not to replace it for now, just in case the engine gives out quicker than something happens with the chain. And then, there wouldn't be any point in replacing the chain first, then blowing the engine, and then having to replace it anyway, whether it's a used one or whatever. So, it didn't make sense to go down that path. We waited for the engine to fail. It happened, we took it apart. We threw in new chains, new bearings, new rings, and all the necessary gaskets that were required. We also replaced the crankshaft seal and other similar parts. And we reassembled everything with new parts. Check out the pile of old parts. Our goal here was to quickly bring the drum back to life and get it running, since the season wasn't over yet. So imagine, from the moment we started disassembling the engine to when it started running again, only 3 days passed. Now take a look. We have a dilemma. There are basically 3 options. 1. Realize that that's it. 400 horsepower is kind of the limit. It's enough to go back to stage 3 and run it with water methanol injection pushing 353 horsepower. Maybe do another 355, something like that. There's a second option. We plan to install forged parts, which many of you mentioned. There were probably 100 comments in the previous video asking for forged parts. Well, as you can now understand, we weren't ready for it. Forged parts need to be ordered, and the connecting rods need to be replaced. And then we could try pushing it further. But when tuning on stock components with this turbo, we could already see that it was starting to overboost. Its limit is probably around 410, 430 horsepower, so we won't be getting much more than that. There's still a difference, but we could give it a try. Then we could think about the turbo, maybe a larger one. Well, anyway, I just came up with a third option. With this setup, using the used piston, we could still try to play around with the tuning and see if we can push more than 400 horsepower out of it. So how could we do that? As you understand, it's possible that this piston failed due to some minor detonation that happened. Or maybe it was caused by the turbo overboosting. Maybe the air-fuel mixture was too lean. Or the injector wasn't delivering enough fuel. But at these levels, everything needs to work smoothly and ideally with new parts. In theory, we could add more alcohol to the fuel, run it on alcohol-based fuel, swap the injectors, and try to push 410, 415 horsepower. I think it's possible and it should hold up. But that's our third option, the craziest and most daring one. I really wouldn't want to end up in the same situation again. So look, there's a real option to go with forged parts, at least a simple setup. We actually have a colleague from Kharkiv, and we're planning to invite him for some racing with M-cars this spring. He's got a full T4 setup with all sorts of goodies, fuel system, oil pump, and a bunch of other upgrades, so it costs way more than just getting pistons. So, when people write in the comments, just throw in some forged pistons and rods, and that's it, no worries, they don't realize it's not that simple. The right way to do it isn't just by throwing in pistons and rods. Properly, you'd also need to reinforce the block, install metal spindles, essentially strengthening the area between the skirt. Since the N20 has pistons, open sleeves, and no support around them, they insert metal reinforcements, similar to how a semi-closed block is made, like on the B58. So, it's a complete reinforcement process if you want to properly prep the engine for, say, around 500 horsepower. So to do it right, you need to prepare everything thoroughly. Reinforcements, studs, and all that. But as experimenters, our budget has run out. That's not what I'm saying. I just want to say that I'm considering a more budget-friendly option, just going with forged pistons, nothing too crazy. There's a Russian-made piston development called STI. I had those installed on E46 Turbo Niva STI pistons. Install such pistons. They can withstand approximately 100 horsepower per cylinder, minimum. And some connecting rods, roughly 100 euros per cylinder. We can try to push our turbo to its peak. Without fear of the piston breaking, maybe something else will break instead, we can still try to take on the M series, at least in stock form. I think this drum is more than capable. We've got a T4 setup on a budget build. This is going to be a custom solution that very few would even consider attempting. But this is purely to send the car into orbit with the ST4 setup and make sure it boosts past all the M series. The N20 will definitely dominate them. Judging by the comments, I think you guys are leaning toward going full stage 4. And let's get to the numbers. How much did the project come out? From stage 2 to stage 3. I mean, you can easily calculate stage 2 with our managers, plus we have discussed it in other videos. But we haven't discussed stage 3 yet. The most important component. We change the turbo. We take a turbo, like your old one. This time we turn to TurboDoc. There's a place like this in Kyiv. He made an N20 hybrid turbo for $850. If you don't want to remove your own and be without a turbo for 2 or 3 weeks, maybe even a month, you can buy a used one. It costs about $500, and you'll still need to add another $850. We installed the turbo. We changed some small original parts, roughly for about $50. I'm not exactly sure. Plus, the labor cost was around $100. In total, it comes out to $850. So it's $850 plus $50 for parts plus $100 for labor, totaling $1,000. If you think that's expensive, it's actually not. To make a hybrid on a B58, it's over $1,000. That's pretty solid. So for a B58 hybrid turbo, if you send them your used one, it's 2,500 euros. And if you don't, it costs 4,500 euros. Seems like a good deal for that price, especially considering how much more they charge for similar work in other regions. You know, $850 to give, that's kind of... It's not the same. Here's the methanol. As you know, I got it from my E46. I bought it a while ago, and it cost around $450. The installation of it. In different places, people price it differently. Some say 300, some say 400. Some might even sell it for 200 or 100. Anyway, the mechanic installed it for us, by the way. The same fast mechanic who swapped the engine. He installed it pretty quickly, I don't know, in just a few hours. Well, let's count that we spent around $100 on it. And by the way, let's not forget, the methanol system was installed. A tuned metal pipe, so we can't just install it in stock car. Only in the FTP pipe, or maybe you have a tuned one, with a hole just for the water meth nozzle. We're also going to do the M55 Stage 3 project. So, this water methanol setup will still be useful. I'm on the M55, the engine won't fall off there. And the third thing is the tuning. The tuning for Dark Horse, with a configuration like this, costs around, as Alexei told me, from $1,200 to $1,500. It depends on how you negotiate, but through us, it can be done cheaper. I don't know though. Promo code OPOP. Yes, discount with promo code OPOP. Write me, I'll work something out. In total, for the parts and tuning, it comes to $2,550, plus the turbo installation, water methanol setup. Well, roughly. That's stage 2. Because if you have a stock car, well, I doubt you'd be willing to spend $4,700 to make it stage 3. It's probably easier to sell it, buy a 335, and there you'll have 360, 370 horsepower on stage 1 if it's a PWG, and around 380 if it's an EWG.
There. And that's basically the reason why so few people go for stage 3 on the 328i.
Well, we didn't start this project to push stage 3 or promote it or anything like that. It's pretty clear that this is a kind of stillborn project, so to speak. There are some fans who really love their 328i. Maybe it's a cool trim, or they've already invested a lot of money into it, or it means a lot to them. If they're already running stage 2 and it's not enough for them, then sure, it makes sense for them to go stage 3, spend more money, and make it faster and cooler. 350 horsepower for the N20 engine worked like a charm. You saw how smoothly it handled those long, powerful, and tough races. So 300 horsepower on a stage 2. For it, that power is really easy, and there's no indication it will break down at that level. This experiment with the N20 is really interesting to me personally, because about 5 years ago, I was watching YouTube, and all these bloggers were saying that the N20 was junk, not reliable, that it wouldn't last more than 100,000 kilometers, and that it was basically useless for anything. And now I realize that this experiment personally checks a certain box for me, because about 5 years ago, I was watching YouTubers, watching their reviews on the N20, N55 engines. They were saying these engines don't last, that the N20 breaks down after 100,000 kilometers and isn't suitable for tuning, and that we're just torturing it. And now, in 2024, we have the chance to experiment on our own skin, as you said, risking our own hide, and here's where this project comes in. Just proves that 200,000 kilometers is not a death sentence. The N20 engine can easily handle 300 plus horsepower without issues. So all you N20 haters, go fuck yourselves and hold this. I think you liked our drum. Next, we want to start a new project, an N55 F10 535i with 360,000 kilometers on the clock. Just think about that, the highest mileage I found for an N55 in Ukraine, and it's real. The car is from the USA, the mileage is not tampered with, and it still has the original engine. This is a rare thing. It's not like the N20 with 200,000 kilometers. This is 360,000 kilometers. Just imagine, the N55's cooling system is going to be pushed to the limit. We want to do a stage 3 on it, aiming for around 500 horsepower, something similar to what we did with the 328i. I think you'll really like it, so be sure to like, subscribe, and comment. And don't forget, we're still working with the N20 and the 328i. You're watching this video now, and you can decide the fate of this project.